When religious people want to know God, they turn to ancient history, and unbeknownst to them, they act somewhat as a historian. The problem with this is that most religious people are never trained in historical analysis or evaluation, and therefore are at somewhat of a loss in that regard when analyzing ancient history. You're going to hear me talking a lot more about this because when we study religion, in large part, we are historians. We are looking to the distant past to analyze texts. That's the case with Hinduism and the Vedas, Islam and the Quran, and Christianity and Judaism with the Bible. So deeply and fundamentally intertwined with the study of religion is the study of history. And we all are little historians in a way. All religious people and all people who are critical of religion and skeptical of religion as well. This video is going to be particularly valuable because we are going to hear the words of a professional historian, a professor at Cornell University who is very astute and widely published and is looked to as an authority in this field. Professor Barry Strauss is a classicist and a military and naval historian and consultant. He is a professor of history and classics, Bryce and Edith M. Bomar Professor in Humanistic Studies at Cornell University, the visiting Corliss Dean Page Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and series editor of Princeton's Turning Points in Ancient History. This guy knows his stuff. I want to highlight parts of this lecture that spans, I think, an hour and 45 minutes, something like that. I'll put a link in the description of the entire lecture so you can go listen to it on YouTube. I don't want to infringe on any copyright stuff, so here I'm just going to be summarizing a lot of it, but I will give you actual parts of his lecture so you can hear his words for yourself, because I think that would provide the most value. So I hope YouTube doesn't hit me with any copyright stuff for doing these little snippets of his lecture, but I really want you to hear his thoughts from his mouth. So his lecture centers on the assassination of Julius Caesar. He says this is one of the most well-recorded events in ancient history, and he goes on to describe the different sources that historians use to analyze this event, his assassination. And he also at the end talks a little bit about his burial. But what I want to highlight is his perspective on ancient sources, his methods of analysis, and his general mentality when it comes to evaluating ancient sources, and how we can use this today to evaluate ancient religious sources, ancient religious texts. And I'll reiterate this, definitely go and watch his lecture. After you watch this video, you will benefit tremendously because of it.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here at Hillsdale.
So after his intro in the lecture and his opening remarks, he gets into the sources that historians use to get an overall sketch of Caesar's assassination and the details therein, if they are able indeed to get any concrete details. And he gives 5 different sources that historians mainly use for this event. The first source he gives is Nicholas of Damascus and his Life of Augustus, which technically we don't have anymore, but we have a summary of that original work that was composed quite a bit later than the original composition of the work. So he gives that as the first source. And then secondly, he gives Plutarch and his Parallel Lives, which was written around 100 CE, about 150 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Thirdly, he cites Suetonius, which wrote his Lives of the 12 Caesars circa 120 CE. Fourth, he cites Appian of Alexandria, who circa 150 CE wrote a universal history and a history of Rome. And then Dio Cassius, who composed his works circa 200 to 230 CE. So those are the 5 sources that historians mainly use to understand the assassination of Julius Caesar. I'll reiterate them just quickly. Nicholas of Damascus, Plutarch, Suetonius, Appian of Alexandria, and Cassius Dio, or Dio Cassius. So I want to give you 5 little snippets of his lecture and then give you a little bit of commentary on them. This is the first one.
The bad news is that very few of these sources are contemporary sources, and none of the sources, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely none of them is objective.
So this little snippet emphasizes the way that ancients did history, the way that they reported things back then. They were not objective.
There's a good reason for that, and that's because the ancients scorned objectivity. They didn't believe in objectivity in the sense that we do. They believed in accuracy and in truth, but they thought that the way to reach truth and the way to accuracy was not by being objective, but by telling their audience what they needed to hear, what was most important for them to hear. They felt it was their job to shape and improve the raw data to reach the truth.
And this was their way of doing things. It was very different from the way that we do history today. Our methods of history, our methods of reporting are very, very different than they were 2,000 years ago. At another point in the lecture, he speaks of Caesar Augustus' work, his memoir, and then he goes on to comment on the nature of that memoir. And this is what he says about that memoir of Caesar Augustus.
It was supposed to be tell-all autobiography in which he gave you an insider's personal view of his rise to power. I'm tempted to quote the line that Pamela Smith-Hill gave us this afternoon. Not a word of it is true, not even the ands or the thes. We can be sure that there was more propaganda than truth in the Emperor Augustus's memoirs. But
You're obviously not getting the full context from these little snippets, but he speaks of the work of Caesar Augustus because he says that the work of Nicholas of Damascus was influenced by the work of Caesar Augustus. And so that's why he's talking about that. In this third snippet, he talks about Plutarch as a source for the details of Julius Caesar's assassination. And he states in plain language that speeches were often made up in ancient texts.
luckily for us, he was a very honest historian. He went to great effort to get the facts right. He wasn't much interested in chronology, so he's not real good for what happened when. And he compresses timelines. And the speeches, as often in ancient history, are fiction. But the rest of the details are carefully done, and he often cites his sources.
And in this fourth clip, speaking of Dio Cassius, this is what he has to say.
A very learned man who had read widely, but it's clear that when he sat down to write, he sat down to write a little bit like a jazz musician doing a riff. He remembers some of the notes, and the rest he makes up. He didn't have many kind things to say about the assassins, a great believer in the Roman monarchy, but it's a good read. So that's what we've got, folks. As I said, a modern historian would be tearing his hair out at this sort of event. But for a classicist, it's pure joy to have to work through sources like this and to try to piece together what really happened. Just to give you
So this lecture is, by this historian and professor of history, is replete with a sense that we can't exactly trust everything that an ancient text says, that these ancient sources say. They have propaganda. They're not concerned a lot with historical details the same way that we are today. And we simply cannot trust them entirely. We have to use our own thinking and evaluation to determine what actually happened. And he speaks more of this in his synopsis and his ending remarks at the end of the lecture. And so this is what he says there.
So let me sum up. What can we get from the ancient sources? How trustworthy are the ancient sources for Caesar's assassination? The sources, from the point of view of just the facts, are not trustworthy at all. But because the sources, the ancient sources, force us to walk with the greats, they are trustworthy indeed.
Now, are we to completely disregard and denounce this perspective of ancient history and this method of historical analysis when it comes to Christian texts? No, we are not. Christians wrote things very early on in the history of Christianity, very closely to the time in which Jesus lived. But we cannot simply disregard this mentality, these critical thinking skills and evaluation skills when it comes to the Gospels and the epistles whatsoever. We have to keep them in mind, and not only when analyzing Christianity, but also when analyzing Islamic texts, such as the Quran and the Hadith, and also the Vedas of the Hindus.